Final Fantasy is a franchise that will have many recurring elements through the different games, as it's part of their charm and nature, which is already very nice, but the idea of this recap, in a similar fashion to my previous Final Fantasy IX video, is to highlight all the cool references that this game makes to its preceding ones in more specific ways, which to me is always a very lovely detail and show that the team in charge to create this world really care about the product and the legacy of the series. So instead of just saying things like, oh hey, this game has chocobos, this game has Blizzaga, or this game has bombs as enemies, the focus of this video will be to name mostly the origin and inspiration of some bosses, hands, the marking hands, or espers. Final Fantasy XII is not the 12th main installment of the franchise, as you would expect, but rather the 13th, as Final Fantasy X-2 was a thing, and to me, part of the mainline games. But anyway, from the start already, there's something interesting about 12 compared to the previous games, and it's about the development team that led this project. Without too many details, while projects like Final Fantasy X and eventually 13 were part of the team led by Yoshinori Kitase, Final Fantasy XII team was led by Yasumi Matsuno, which for this video is important to learn that it's the same that worked previously on Final Fantasy Tactics, mainly because the story sets on the same world of Ippalis, and as we are exploring all the cool references that there are to previous games, there's going to be some specifics that we can recognize from Tactics that will come up eventually for this reason of being the same universe. So before we explore the first bosses Final Fantasy XII has that alludes to previous games, it's good to be mindful that through this video I'll be talking about this game and previous one, so there will be spoilers of them. And that includes some important moments in Tactics, so be aware of that. We'll be going through in chronological order, first following the main story of 12, then check the hands, the marking hands, and lastly the espers. Final Fantasy XII makes the return of the enemy known as the Demon Wall. As its name implies, it is indeed a wall. Found as a trap at the Dynast King tomb, it shares the same mechanic as its first introduction in Final Fantasy IV, which is getting closer and closer to you, being the last thing most intruders see before it bears down upon them, crushing their bones to dust. This version is more a mechanical monster-like creature, while the ones in Final Fantasy IV and later in Final Fantasy VII are clearly a straight-up wall with a demon coming out of it. The latter version doesn't have this mechanic where it's getting closer to you as a time limit battle, but will attack you in a similar manner, throwing itself at you. Our favorite dragon, Tiamat, made it to this compilation too, as she deserves. The obvious reference is not only in the name, but the bestiary describes her as an anima of the winds, possessed by a violent temperament. And Tiamat, in the original Final Fantasy, was one of the 4 Fiend of Chaos, in particular the Fiend of Wind, atop the Flying Fortress, referencing this wind connection that the dragon has. And as I'm making this video, information of the upcoming Stranger of Paradise is being released, and with that, this super cool looking picture and renders of Tiamat are out, this being of course attached to Final Fantasy I. Which is, I find so cool how you have a female human body attached to the multi-dragon heads. Those designs are always my favorite in Final Fantasy. This one is a little bit weird because it's not about the boss in the game, but rather a common enemy, whose name alludes to a very important boss in Final Fantasy V, and that is the boss Twintania. While in Final Fantasy XII this is a snow worm-like dragon, there tends to be categories which many similar looking monsters belong to. In 5, this is the last boss before entering the last floor of the interdimensional rift, and the last remaining monster from the group known as Demons of the Rift, a group of 13 enemies summoned by the main antagonist X-Death in the latest part of the game. So pretty big deal, and thought it was worth mentioning this little callback that can be easily missed. Okay, I may be cheating again, but hear me out. At the end of Sochen Cave Palace, there's an undead lord enemy called Ahriman, a very recurring enemy in the franchise, but instead of being a ghost, they look like this. Or this. Or this. Oh, this one's ugly. The 3D doesn't look any prettier. So why is it so different in this game? Well, the key, besides the little yellow color it has around, it's this characteristic single eye in the middle of its body. Ain't that cute? I thought it was worth mentioning how different it is. Rafflesia is a plant or flower-like boss out of control because it is affected by the dense mist of the Feywood forest, an allusion to the similar fight in one of the paintings in Gidor Mansion in Final Fantasy VI. Now when you fight them you realize that the name is not exactly matching, but that's because of the quirky translations of original Final Fantasy VI, as its name in Japanese is the same. But hey, the Pixel remasters are out already, so you better check out how they handle those things. They are totally worth getting it, for many other reasons, but you can also check those things. Arriving at the entrance of Giru Vegan, it will be guarded by the boss Daedalus, a guardian statue with no head and some sort of one wing in the best modern Sephiroth style. This name, which can also be something like Daedalus, is shared with Final Fantasy VI enemy found at Kefka's Tower, which are two designs completely different. Although, what's interesting about them is that in both games exists a different enemy called Dullahan, which is a palette swap version of the first one. Here we have Daedalus in both games, and their Dullahan version. The Pharaohs of Ridorana Tower will be host of 4 different bosses before reaching the top. The first one being the Black Tortoise with no head apparently, but it's not the appearance what matters, but rather the name. Actually, the appearance is very important and it has a great meaning, but that's for later. The name of such boss is Pandaemonium, and that's a callback to Final Fantasy II very final dungeon, located in the depth of hell itself, as the word Pandaemonium is related to that. And also, if I have an opportunity to mention that place and its best theme ever, then you know I would do it, that's like my top priority. Moving past the main story bosses and going to the hunting missions that Final Fantasy XII provides, first we have one very known enemy, our favorite 6-armed half-serpent female sword user Marilith. Although not exactly looking like that, still is in its serpent form and with a scholar scheme that matches her very first appearance in the original Final Fantasy as one of the 4 Fiend of Chaos, also later in Final Fantasy IX, and even more exciting in the upcoming Stranger of Paradise, where you can already see her looking very sick in the pictures released, and I am very excited for that. This one is a little weird. Atomos is the name of, originally, a boss in Final Fantasy V, but then became a known summon in the series. Not the prettiest, but it has very defined characteristics, like a big old mouth to absorb everything. And in Final Fantasy XII, the classic Final Fantasy summons appear but in the form of airship names. Things like the Ifrit, Leviathan, and the last big bad boy Bahamut. Atomos is included in one of these ships too, so it's weird and fun to mention in my opinion that one of the hunts is a monster with the same name, but it feels like there's not relation between them. The best boss name makes a return in Final Fantasy XII. In my previous video about Final Fantasy IX, Deathgaze made already its appearance, so it's the second time the special optional boss of Final Fantasy VI is referenced. Again, the references in 12 have to be more about names and less about the looks of the creatures. But something they share with the original depiction is that you can find this hunt mark when visiting the deck at any airship you fly with, which is the same way you fight this flying monster in Final Fantasy VI, by encountering it in the air during the World of Ruin, so that's a neat detail. Through all the games of Final Fantasy, you'll find iconic summons that repeat over and over, and some new additions that may appear only once, or that they shine in that game and not much in the others. Such is the case of the Guardian Force in Final Fantasy VIII Diabolos, which started as an optional boss fight. By the name alone you can imagine how dark and metal this entity is. That's why the Final Fantasy XII version has this demonic imp design, with a lot of fire, although still looking pretty different to the original design that will stand out and make its appearance in spin-off games, or remastered versions of older games even. This combination of a floating demon mage and squid, I guess, with a face similar to the Thulu, is the Piscodaemon, the Black Sorcerer. Its name may be a combination of the Latin word Piscis and a demon, so those fish properties may be there. This hand, in name and also looks, is a reference to an enemy boss in the very first Final Fantasy, whose Thulu-like features were recognizable. Now, even if this particular enemy name is only in the first game, there's another type of enemy called the Mind Flyer, whose design is the same but in a different color, and it's present in multiple games, so maybe you are more familiar with this design. When you accept the hunt mission to defeat an enemy called Ultros, and you see that it's a big flan with a specific color palette, you may think it's just a random color to make it feel unique when it's not. But the name won't ring a bell until you realize that it's the same Japanese name as Final Fantasy VI's famous recurring enemy Ultros. Not only that, but when you pay attention at its purple color and its description mentioning the advice, "Don't tease the flan," both are made to reference this purple octopus, who not only is famous in its original appearance, but made it in future games as optional bosses like remasters and Final Fantasy XIII too, so it has its story in the franchise already. I know this is the second headless turtle from this list, and I guess that's weird, but I guess this same type of enemy in different colors is one of the underwhelming things of the game. This turtle enemy is called the Gil Snapper in Final Fantasy XII, and is known by its Japanese name as Gilgamesh, the combination of Gil and the Japanese word for turtle. That's why you can say it's the same enemy as Final Fantasy V, the Gil Turtle. This enemy can be found in the Gil Cave. I wonder why it's called like that. Another familiar face around here. The Antlion makes its way to this game too. After being referenced in Final Fantasy IX, there's also a hunting mark in this game, with the original being in Final Fantasy IV. In this case, you can see that it belongs to the Mantis type of enemy, and you'll find it as a swarm of monsters deep in the loose mines. In every game prior, the Antlions are related to an insectoid type of monster who lives in desert areas or caves near it. I can't leave this good boy behind. Even if it's not the first time after Final Fantasy V that Gilgamesh appears, opposite to Final Fantasy IX, this elite hunt mark is meant to be the same one as its original depiction, and his obsession with getting the legendary swords only grew stronger during its travels. As during the first fight, you can see him bringing up famous weapons like the Bastard Sword, Zidane's Orichalcum, and later the Brotherhood from Tidus. And more importantly, he brought his amazing battle theme with him, so all is well. Oh, I like this one. So far, and including my previous video of the references in Final Fantasy IX, it has been callbacks of the Final Fantasy games from 1 to 7 mostly, for logical reasons. So it's nice to see a Final Fantasy X specific summon in this case, being represented in this game. And that's with the elite Mark Hunt Ixion. In both games, an electric horse or unicorn-like monster. We mentioned before how summons in the franchise can be game specific, and this is the case with Ixion only being in the Final Fantasy X universe at that point. Earlier we talked about how Pandaemonium was a reference, because of its name, but not its looks. Well, there's a reason it looks like that, a black tortoise, and that's because when you reach the hunt mark number 44, you'll fight the Shadow Seer, a ghost-like figure that more importantly summons 4 different creatures to fight. For what this video tries to focus on, I should talk about how other 2 of these beasts are the Fenrir, a white tiger-like creature that was also a Final Fantasy IX specific summon from Eiko, and the Phoenix, which is a more common summon in the franchise. But the true inspiration for these 4 beasts is a different one, and honestly too good not to mention and talk about it. Basically, the 4 creatures are a representation of the Xixian, or the 4 Chinese mythical beasts. These ones being the mentioned Pandaemonium, representing Genbu, the black tortoise of the north, Slit, representing Seiryu, the azure dragon of the east, Fenrir, representing Byakko, the white tiger of the west, and Phoenix representing Suzaku, the vermilion bird of the south. I just love things like that, so I think it's worth mentioning, especially because you may be able to distinguish these beasts in other type of media, as obscure as they may be, like watching Beat X or playing Digimon War 3. Like me. The super boss of Final Fantasy XII, that would probably take 18 hours to beat, has also two meanings that are very cute for different reasons, similar to those for beasts. The cutest of them all lies in its name. This one may be an allusion to the game's director Matsuno Yasumi, which you can create Yiazmat with the first syllable of the name. But not only that, as he had to leave Square before the game was finished, the name of the hunting mission is called Farewell to a Legend. The other allusion, more related to the topic of the video, is that it's surprisingly close to the most famous Final Fantasy superboss, Shinryu, and of course that doesn't show in its looks, neither for the Final Fantasy V original version or the changed Final Fantasy IX one, but rather it seems to act as the substitute of such enemy, as it's not only similar in description as a holy deity among dragons, but also its hunt mission triggered the possibility to fight the other superboss Omega Mark XII, which is the same war machine-like enemy that acts as Shinryu counterpart in Final Fantasy V first and acts as such in future games including this one. So you can have an idea that Yiazmat represents Shinryu for that reason. Moving on to the Espers of Final Fantasy XII, which in a way acts like the summons of this game, but they are not the traditional ones you may know, as those have a spot for the airship names as mentioned before. These ones all have very specific and interesting names and designs, and half of them are inspired by the same game, and such is Final Fantasy Tactics. The relationship between these two games are very special. As mentioned before, not only it was directed by the same team, but also they share the same in-game world of Ivalice, where all the regions and cities and empires are from. So part of the lore of Tactics will make its place to 12, in the form of Espers, or by its name in Tactics, the Lucavi, some group of demons whose mission is to bring back their leader Ultima, the High Seraph. You see that name in a bit, but all the Lucavi that appears as Espers are Belias de Gigas. The first Esper you encounter also matches with the first zodiac sign that they represent, Aries. That's why you see it as a giant with ram-like horns in this case, while Gigas is a common term for a giant enemy. Its element is fire. Adramelech the Wroth, also known as the Wrathful Spirit Emperor. It has a bird or a dragon-like form and its element is lightning. Its head though is a goat, and that is because it represents the zodiac sign of Capricorn. Hashmal, the ruler. Also known as Bringer of Order, Hashmal is associated with the earth element, and with the zodiac sign of Leo, or Lion, that inspires its features in its humanoid design. Cuchulain, the Impure, or maybe Master of Impurity. This one doesn't please me to talk about as a Scorpion myself. I'd rather have a Scorpion-looking creature, but I guess the aim was to focus on its poisonous look and abilities. I guess it's charming in its own way? Maybe? Salera, the Death Seraph. Or to make it different from Ultima, who is the High Seraph, just the Angel of Death is fine, as it's known in Final Fantasy Tactics. It still sounds edgy and that's always a good thing. His element is the Death type, as it should be, and the zodiac sign is Gemini, for reasons. One interesting thing about the bio of this Esper is that it mentioned an Angel of Truth called Emetzolch, which is the name of a major character in Final Fantasy XIV. Ultima, the High Seraph. As just mentioned, Ultima is the leader of the Lucavi in Tactics, and maybe also final boss, who's given the title Angel of Blood, and it's also an Esper in Final Fantasy XII. the holy Esper in terms of elements, and to mirror its important role, acts as the mastermind of the plot of the Espers to rise against the gods who created them, them being the Ocuria. And the zodiac sign is Virgo, which fits nicely. Zodiac, Keeper of Precepts. And lastly, the strongest Esper in Final Fantasy XII, and it's special from the rest because it's that unique 13th creature that represents Ophiuchus, the serpent holder in the Zodiac, who tends to be very special when it's represented in any media. Its uniqueness is also in tactics, as is instead of being part of the Lucavi, acting as a powerful common summon you can use in battles. Moving on from all the Final Fantasy Tactics exclusive and direct monsters, we move on to the rest of them, and the topic, as you may get from this one, is previous Final Fantasy final bosses, specifically from 1 to 5. First of all, we have our friend Chaos, King of Reincarnation. Beside its name, there are some concepts about them that link it together to the original bad boy, like its bio alluding to the cycle of life and time loops, calling it a walker of life's wheel, or its 4 swords surrounding it can be the famous 4 Fiend of Chaos. Mateus the Corrupt, specifically the Corrupt Emperor Mateus, and that's an important detail, as an allusion to Final Fantasy II final boss, whose name is original just Emperor, while the name Mateus was given to him later. Not only that, but the bio mentions how it got corrupted and fell screaming into the depths of hell, there to be imprisoned for eternity, similar to the original Emperor. My favorite Final Fantasy main antagonist, by the way. It is associated with the element of ice, and the zodiac sign is Pisces, which helps her with the design, and in the best Saint Seiya fashion, it's very pretty looking. Famfrit the Darkening Cloud. This Esper is fought alongside Dr. Sid during the main story. May not ring a bell at first glance, but if you take in consideration that it's also known as the Cloud of Darkness, you can immediately relate it to Final Fantasy III final boss with the same name, so that's more straightforward, even if its design has some similarities with Exdeath actually. It controls the element of water and represents the zodiac sign of Aquarius, the water carrier, as he carries a large jug on his shoulder. Zeromus the Condemner. Back to the more direct names, Zeromus, the Condemning Tyrant, is a reference to Final Fantasy IV final boss. They also share their signature attack called Big Bang, and are described as being tainted by hate. It's considered the Esper of the gravity element, represent the zodiac sign of Cancer, the crab, which is why it has a giant claw and look pretty intimidating. Exodus, the Judge Sal, also known as Exdeath, the Tree-Spirit Judge. The Judge part is mainly because it represents the zodiac sign of Libra, so the design with the scales shows that, but besides that, both given names are an allusion to Final Fantasy V main antagonist and final boss, which can be known both as Exdeath or Exodus in the first translations of the game, so that's a cute allusion. The Esper also desires to bring the world into nothingness, or the famous void. And the other thing is that the entity known as Exdeath in the Final Fantasy V lore mentions him as part or born from a tree of the Great Forest of Moor, similar to how here is referred to as a tree. Now here's the fun thing. So far we mentioned 12 Espers, for 12 zodiac signs, right? Well, one of those was Ophiuchus, so there's one more to cover, and that's the sign of Sagittarius, which is why it's depicted as half horse, half woman. This is covered by the Esper Shemhazai, the Whisperer or Betrayer, but who is she alluding to? If we follow the logic so far, from the Final Fantasy Tactics that share the same universe, there's no appearance of such being, so it must be a mainline final boss. In her bio, it mentions how she betrayed the gods to serve Ultima in the rebellion, teaching men about destruction and evil. The truth is that there is no concrete answer, so there's only a space to speculate who may allude to. Of course, the most possible answer is to no one, but that's no fun. We have to think about our options. Is it Kefka from Final Fantasy VI, as it's the next gaming line? Maybe with the concept of rebelling against his master and using the gods of the Warring Triad? Or is it Ultimecia from Final Fantasy VIII, for the mere fact that it's the closest in appearance, being a female entity sharing some designs like those weird side horns on their heads, and the color palette, maybe? Any answer may go, as it's only a headcanon and no confirmation, but still fun to think about it personally, and worth to mention. And that's it for the references found in Final Fantasy XII, regarding the bosses and special enemies that exist mainly. I think this is the first game that takes place in the same world as another one, like that is not a sequel or anything, so it's bound to find a lot of coincidences, not even callbacks at that point. So for that reason, plus the fact that I'm not the most expert on Final Fantasy tactics, the idea was to focus on very specific enemies from the mainline games, as it's a pretty detail, especially when it was a game made by a different team than usual, but still keeping the same love and respect for the franchise. I'd like to mention once more that by the time this video is out, Stranger of Paradise Final Fantasy Origin will be very close to release, and I'm sure that if you, like me, loves to find these references and appreciate them when they do that, then you'll enjoy that game much more. I'll be excited to check that out more than anything else. If you like the video and the whole franchise, I appreciate if you can give a like, follow, whatever that's called, or any type of support. I try to create videos around the Final Fantasy franchise, while sharing my first experience with those games I haven't played yet. I just finished uploading the Final Fantasy XII experience, so there's that, while I stream on Twitch currently on a Final Fantasy VI Pixel Remaster hype train, because the music in those games is just too good. So yeah, that's it. I hope you are doing well, take care of yourselves, do what you enjoy what you do, play some Final Fantasy. I'll see you later. Love you!